Today we will be studying the cross-sectional view of the spinal cord. So to review, the spinal cord is made up of nervous tissue and it is located in your vertebral cavity and it runs down your mid-sagittal plane. And so if we were to take a cross-section, slice it so that we have a superior and an inferior view, and if we were to zoom in on that cross-section, looking at it from the superior view, so from the top, this is what it would look like. So let's talk about some of these components and what makes up your spinal cord. First though, let's keep in mind some orientation and some anatomical orientation. And so the top region right here is going to be your dorsal or posterior side. So this is going to be the side that faces the back. And then the other side is going to be the ventral side or anterior. And so this is going to be the side of the spinal cord that faces your belly or is more closer to your belly. So first off, when you take a look at the spinal cord, you'll notice that the spinal cord extends nerves on either side. So these are what we call spinal nerves, and we're going to be talking about the different branches and what they're called specifically in a moment. But the spinal cord extends spinal nerves on the left and the right side in a symmetrical fashion. So when we highlight and discuss the anatomy of one side, keep in mind that there is a mirror image that exists on the other side of the spinal cord. Okay, so let's begin. So the first thing that you'll notice is that the spinal cord has an internal butterfly structure. And this is actually made up of gray matter on the inside, forming a butterfly section. And gray matter in nervous tissue usually is given this name and coloration due to the presence of cell bodies and dendrites, so unmyelinated structures. Whereas if you compare the outside of the spinal cord, this is going to be composed of white matter. And so this white matter is given again this coloration due to the presence of myelin. And so we have in this area, the myelinated axons give off the white coloration. In addition, what you're going to notice is that this butterfly structure has what we call horns extending on the posterior or dorsal side, as well as the anterior or the ventral side. And so because of this, these right here are what we call the posterior or the dorsal horns of the gray matter. They kind of give off a horn appearance. And we'll talk about their significance in a moment. On the other side, we have what we call ventral or anterior horns. We also have, in some regions of the spinal cord, what we call lateral horns, and they exist in the thoracic as well as part of the lumbar region. So these are what we call lateral horns. Connecting the left and the right sides, we have this region right here that we refer to as the gray commissure, because we have, of course, communication between the left and the right side of the body, and so the gray commissure is the pathway that these neurons will take in order to communicate. And then finally, located right in the middle, we have our central canal. And this is a canal that runs throughout the spinal cord, and it contains cerebrospinal fluid. So now let's go ahead and talk about what these horns contain. But in order to understand what these horns contain, we need to understand the pathway of neurons, or the pathway of input or messages that come towards and exit out of the spinal cord. So the first thing that you want to note is that the spinal cord receives sensory information. And this sensory information usually comes in through the spinal nerves from the corresponding region of the body, and it comes in via a sensory neuron. And so a sensory neuron is typically what we call unipolar because it contains a cell body that has one process exiting out of it. So if you remember from our neuron anatomy lesson, we were discussing the different classifications of neurons structurally. And so one of them was a unipolar neuron, typically a sensory neuron. And this is what we're going to see right here. You're going to see that sensory neurons bring in information to the spinal cord, and then they have their cell bodies located in a swelling in a part of a branch of the spinal nerve. So let's review. So we have our spinal nerve bringing in sensory information via a sensory neuron. And so the direction of this input is actually going to loop and enter the spinal cord from the dorsal view. So this is always going to be sensory input via a sensory neuron. So these sensory neurons branch out of the spinal nerve into what we call the dorsal root. So one branch of the spinal nerve brings in sensory information into the dorsal side, and this is called the dorsal root, and it contains sensory neurons. In addition, you'll also see a swelling right here, and this is what contains the sensory neuron ganglia, or a collection of cell bodies. So this swelling right here is what we call the dorsal root ganglia. Now let's trace the pathway. So we have sensory information coming in from the dorsal side, and we know that sensory neurons are going to relay information to interneurons. And these interneurons are going to be located inside the gray matter of the spinal cord, and specifically in this dorsal or posterior horn. So these are going to be your interneurons that receive information at the site of the dorsal horn, and they receive it from your sensory neurons. Now, after this input is integrated and interpreted, interneurons will then relay this information back out of the spinal cord, but this time it's going to occur at the ventral or the anterior side. So, located inside the ventral horn of the gray matter, we have cell bodies of motor neurons. And these motor neurons are going to send out information through the ventral side of the spinal cord through a branch that we call this time the ventral root. So the ventral root contains axons of the motor neurons until it joins back the spinal nerve and exits to the corresponding part of the body.